China study, that whole thing.
China study,
oh yeah.
yeah, it's nonsense.
Okay, so where were we again? Oh, you
Well,
had, yeah.
we were saying, people say, there's nothing to eat on a low carb diet, and you stick a pin in the La Russe Gastronomique, which the big French food encyclopedia, probably within 3 pages of a low carb dish.
Mm.
But people keep saying that anyway. So I'm going to tell my joke as to what I really think about this business. Not a sophisticated joke, but the priest and the rabbi just happen to be sitting next to each other on the plane. And they start talking, and at one point the priest says, "Tell me, Rabbi, have you ever eaten pork?" And Rabbi says, "Well, yeah, I was young. We were on a camping trip, that's all there was." And a few minutes later, the rabbi says to the priest, "Tell me, Father, have you ever been with a woman?" And the priest says, "Well, I was young. It was before I took my vows, and you know how things are." And a few minutes later, the rabbi says, "Sure beats pork, doesn't it?" So you're going to have to give up something.
Yeah.
If you're going to change something, you're going to have to do it. This is the smallest change you can make.
Yeah.
So.
And I'd entirely agree. I must say, I personally, and well, it's n equals 1, but I think in terms of evidence, the n equals 1 is multiplied now by tens of thousands. So if you put them all together.
Well, the low carbers, the Active Low Carbers Forum, which is an online support group, the internet. Last time I looked, they had more than 150,000 members.
Right.
And you have to understand, this is a group where you have to actually do something. You have to say how much weight you want to lose. And
right, they're engaged.
So yeah. Well, I mean, there are a lot more people who are actually doing it, but they actually do something. Now, not every one of them loves low carb diets, but the great majority do. So 150,000 people is a lot of people as a indicator. And in terms of what they eat, I took a poll which we published on the change in their diet, surprisingly, was they added more vegetables and more greens. Only a small fraction increased what I call the 3 Bs of low carb dieting, beef, butter, and bacon. And very small fraction increased all of those. About 20% increased each of them. So the main thing is that, well, it stands to reason. If you think of your diet as typical dinner as a steak and potato and broccoli, if you take out the potato, you're unlikely to put in more steak even if you can afford it.
Yeah.
If you put in anything, it's going to be the broccoli. But you may be happy just leaving it out. So,
and that is true. It can be as simple as just dropping out a certain element and just eating the remaining, maybe slightly more, but probably more vegetables. I mean, I switched in meat. I used to eat lean meat, tragically, high protein and low fat, believing it was good. And what I've changed in my meat is obviously I get fattier cuts now, and I get a lot more fat in there. But otherwise, it's just dropping the potato, or when there's rice, having a very small amount of rice rather than a large amount. Breakfasts, of course, all the cereals and are gone from our house for 2 years. And we have eggs and real food and bacon, real ancestral food.
For most people, it's really easy to do. And I understand that there are people who have a real sweet tooth. So most people report that after 3 days without sweets, they lose their craving.
Yes.
I understand that it's not true for everybody. Some people still love it.
Yeah.
And
well, speaking of sweet, then the whole sugar versus carb debate. You have some particularly strong thoughts on that. That focusing on the sugar, which is everyone accepts. I mean, it's glucose and fructose. It has no nutrient value. You know, it's not a good thing to eat a lot of sugar. That's universal. But the current focus on anti-sugar has a danger of distracting from the bigger question, which is we need to be lower in carb.
I think that's a serious problem. I will show you a picture that I took of the in the university hospital at Downstate, and it's a vending machine that cut out all the sweets. There are no candies there, but they're all high carb, high grain, healthy starch, and I don't think that's accomplished anything. And that's and you can't say that that is what everybody will respond to, but unless you exclude that message, you're going to make it hard for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Basically, what we know about sugar is what we knew from Lewis Carroll. Alice in Wonderland, there was the Queen described the sisters who were at the bottom of the well, and all they ate was treacle. And Alice said, well, if they only ate treacle, they'd be very sick. And the Queen said, oh, they were very sick. If you eat too much sugar, you're going to get sick, and you're certainly going to get fat. But that's not to say that sugar is a poison. You can do without sugar and get fat, have heart disease, and all kinds of problems just on starch.
Yes.
And for diabetes, starch is worse than sugar.
Right.
I have, unfortunately, I did not request the permission, so I won't attribute the email from a major researcher in sugar who says that in diabetes, glucose is more important than fructose.
Right.
I don't know whether anybody opposes that, but I don't want to quote anybody without permission.
So when you reach that state of hyperinsulinemia, that diabetic state, effectively then, glucose is as bad, or as you say, possibly worse.
Well, yeah, it's almost surely worse because of the effect on insulin. And, the kinds of studies that try to show that fructose is inherently worse.
Is fructose a kind of accelerator in a sense? If you're taking too much glucose, then the fructose you're taking straight to the liver will tend, if you're taking a lot of glucose in at the same time, to not be converted into 3-carbon glucose or whatever, will tend more towards triglyceride pathway.
Maybe.
That's the simplistic
but maybe
way.
not. I mean, here's the data which I put in the book. Here's the effect on plasma triglycerides, fructose compared to glucose. Now the red is the fructose. Now you can see on the average, it's worse. There's a bigger increase.
True.
But look at the error bars. Nobody has an average response. So you're betting that your response will fall within the guys that are high and not in the guys that overlap with the glucose people. Or that the glucose, that you won't have a high response with the glucose. The question is simple. If you have a high carbohydrate diet and you have some problem that you want to correct, you're overweight or you have diabetes, should you take carbohydrate out of your diet, any carbohydrate, and put in fat, any fat, leaving out trans fat, but putting in any fat?
Yes.
Or should you take the fructose out of your diet and put in glucose? So it is take out carbohydrate and put in fat, or take out glucose and put in fructose. That's the question. The fact that nobody has done this experiment, which is easy to do, the people who are funded to do fructose research could do it easily. Why don't they do it? They don't do it because they know how it'll come out. Well, I don't know that. I mean, as they say on the TV courtroom dramas, it goes to credibility.
Yeah.
We don't know why they do it. Maybe they did do it and it was too hard to do something, but it should be done.
Yeah, ideally it should be teased out. You by raising that there, actually you raised another point, is the difference of the means versus the standard deviations across all participants. So I kind of view this relatively simplistically if I put it for the audience. So if you do a dietary trial with diet A and B, and diet A loses 2 kilograms over the period, let's say plus or minus 0.5, on the error on the mean, and diet B loses 4 kilograms, plus or minus 1. Now, you could say, well, some people on diet B will do worse than someone on diet A. But still you'd have to accept that diet B on average is better. So I suppose there on average fructose is higher. So you kind of accept
that's fine as long as you're sure that you're getting the data that you can analyze.
Well, yeah.
Why not plot all the points?
Well, that would be ideal, yeah. Scatter diagram, and you really get to see it.
Yeah, and you don't even need a scatter diagram. I mean,
or any form of showing the full
one of the
story
things,
the data
one of the
has to
things
tell.
is that they're showing what they're showing there is a trajectory. In other words, a time course.
Yeah.
Well, you can't average a time course because some people may go up and then down, and some people may go down and then up. You have to show everybody's behavior.
Yeah, ideally.
And when you do that, here's a very good study from Nuttall and Gannon at the University of Minnesota. They do very careful work, and they published, I'm going to have to find this, but they published a paper where they showed you what 10 people did, and there's a big difference, but they all got better on a low-carb diet.
Yeah.
Okay, some of them, some of them became normal. These people with diabetes, they got normal control. Most didn't, but all got better. So there's no reason not to show individual data in many cases. But you have to understand what the basis of traditional statistics of a mean and standard deviation is. And it says that there is some kind of true value, and that the reason that you don't see that true value is whatever, wind resistance or a bad day at the office, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Okay, that's probably not true in a diet experiment. People are different. They're inherently different, and they're drastically different. So what you have to do is see what the range of responses are. And basically in a diet experiment, you're asking, what should I bet on? Where should I place my bet? And there you got to get a good view of the payout. Now, finding the right statistic to deal with that is difficult. We suggested a way of doing that that's what's called a matrix, which is that you look at take the two groups and look at how much weight they lost, for example, and then look at all the differences. And what you will get then is a view of what the potential differences are. And I can show you the thing for the video, and basically you can color code it and you can eyeball the results. And then you can say, this diet looks okay, but I don't know how much I want to bet on it.
Right.
And what we did when we published this is we did a study that Jeff Volek did comparing low carb and a low fat diet. And the differences were clear. There was a big difference. What was drastic, what was dramatic on the color-coded thing was that the people in low carb diet, you had a much better chance of really hitting it big. They're the ones that had the biggest differences compared to the low fat. So on average, low carb was ahead, but not so dramatically. But when you looked at your odds of getting a really big hit, that's where you did best on low carb.
So in a sense, the people who needed it most won big.
Yeah.
And they're the people who most need to diet in generally anyway, probably. So yeah, very good. Volek, Professors Volek and Finney have some excellent work out there. And in fact, I was asked, we did an interview with Dr. Eric Westman from Chicago yesterday morning, I think. And that came up. He asked us, You know, if you're confronted by people who say, oh, but low carb is dangerous, isn't it? Or prove it to me, prove it's okay. And he asked us that question, and what sprang to mind for me was Professor Volek and Finney, and of course your paper, which lays out the key for diabetes. But when they did the lower carb, in a dose-response sense, all the measures of inflammation got better. So all the lipids got better. And I can't remember the exact title, but one of Volek's one shows it's in the paper, of course.
Well, this is actually I'll give you this is this is the so-called the journal calls this the graphic abstract, and this shows you how dramatic the difference is.
Yeah.
And you know, you could say, well, down the road there's a risk, so it's your choice. You can get immediate demonstrable benefit right off, or not if you're afraid that down the line you might have some problem. But down the line has been at best conjectural. They've never been able to actually show it. So you're giving up an opportunity to get immediate benefit on the chance, which is now really weak, that there'll be some deficit down the line. Doesn't make sense.
And there's no basis for a concern of a deficit down the line, because the problem is everyone is assuming there must be some correctness in what we were told 40 years ago. But that's wrong.
Well, let me interrupt, because what I ask medical students is, I ask them this before I start describing this. Now, I teach medical students low-carb diets as a way of getting at the physiologic role of insulin. We're a basic science department, and outside of diabetes, we're not recommending anything in particular. But I do have to present the data on low carb. What I say to them is, do you think there's ever been a time in the history of medicine when the great majority of physicians and scientists held to an idea that was not only wrong but dangerous, and they persisted in that idea even in the face of contradictory evidence? Do you think that's ever happened in medicine? Well, of course they do. They don't say anything. I mean, I don't really ask them to vote. And I said, well, you know, if you think that has happened ever, you got to at least consider the possibility that it's happened again, that this is another such period. And why it happens is a different question.
And it is a complex one.
Yeah, being fair, it's easy to make a mistake.
Yeah. And if there's political and economic imperatives driving the mistake and consolidating it, you know, people are human. But what I tend to say to people, I was asked the question in a seminar there, I did a brief one on diabetes, and I said basically, if you accept that and which is a fact, there was no real evidence worthy of the name to say that fat was a problem at the time. And I think Zoe Harcombe came out recently with a nice little paper that looked at the actual experimental trial evidence at the time they brought out the guidelines, and there was no evidence. So if you accept there was no evidence and get over that first, and even now the correlational epidemiological trials are showing replacing fat with carbohydrate confers greater risk, right?
It always did.
It always did.
That's the most amazing thing. That I describe in this book. The way I got into this is I had to teach nutrition. And whereas I'm trained as a biochemist and I know metabolism, but really I only knew my own nutrition. Because since I was 8 years old, I've been fighting fat, and I always knew that carbohydrates were the thing. But I didn't know that in a scholarly sense, in a way to teach students. So my first lectures were, you know, there's this diet, there's that diet. So I went back to the literature to try to get it straightened out. And the first thing I came across was one of these epidemiologic studies, actually a summary from Hu and Willard at the Harvard School of Public Health. And basically it showed that carbohydrates, on average, were worse than fat.
Yeah.
What? I mean, I always thought that the low-fat idea was not very important, but I never looked at it very carefully. I mean, the reason is that biology doesn't run on what's called mass action, which is the law that chemical reactions respond to how much stuff you have. Biology responds to feedback control.
Yes.
And so I didn't believe much in low fat, but I didn't know. I thought, well, as you say, I thought there must be some grain of truth in it. The fat in the diet is clearly relevant, but the low fat ideal in diet, if it's not a complete fraud, it's close.
Yeah. With the nasty twist that fat can be a problem if you're bringing in quite a lot of carbohydrate with it, because it can't be metabolized and it goes the wrong way. And that was the kind of half-truth that supported it. There's scenarios where fat can be bad, but only in the context of excessive carbohydrate. But that reality can be used to almost smear fat in a sense.
Well, that's how it's used. Well, also there's other data. I mean, the rodent data can be very good, but rodents are a terrific biochemical model for a lot of things. Not good on diet. I don't know why, because I don't think anybody's really looked at the key parameters. But in my lab, we showed that a rat on a high-fat diet will get fat in the absence of any carbohydrate. It just didn't happen to people, you know. So it's not a good model. It's also easy to control a rodent within certain parameters of what's known. Because there are no mice, there are only laboratory mice. They're mice that are bred for certain characteristics, and they're no longer quote mice. They're a specific breed. So it's easy to control them under fixed laboratory conditions. But if you want to do something that you can easily jump to what people do, it's hard to do.
And that would apply even if you had wild type rats and mice, but I have a sense, or I've read some summaries where rats and mice have been bred to be obese for certain intakes, so it's almost like the deck is stacked in favor of fat is bad, which is kind of a form of fraud, but I don't know if the people doing it really realize what they're doing.
Well, it's not fraud in the sense that you want to, when you want to find things out, you want to bias things. You want to get the extreme case and see what happens. So if you want to prevent cardiovascular disease, you want a mouse that gets atherosclerosis very easily. If you want to say that something causes cardiovascular disease, you don't want to go with the classic C57 Black 6 is the name of the mouse that's widely used. Some wit on the internet, because somebody showed a low-carb diet was giving C57 Black 6 mice atherosclerosis. And somebody said giving a C57 Black 6 mouse atherosclerosis is the behavioral equivalent of teaching a cat to go to sleep. It just doesn't tell you much. Actually, I said that.
Yeah, very good. We might return just briefly to that we did talk about fructose versus glucose. The political side of that, so whatever about the biochemical side we spoke of, having too much focus on sugar, although too much sugar is bad, as we agreed.
Well, it is. It's a remake of saturated fat. You know, one of the problems with the long the long attack on saturated fat, one of the bad effects is, are we sure that saturated fat is harmless in all contexts? No, we're not, because we can't. We'll never find out, because we've been crying wolf for so long that we can never analyze an experiment with a clear head.
Yeah.
So if you make fructose into a poison, you'll never find out what it's good or bad for, and that's the real problem.
And also, is there another level that if the battle is taken to sugar, and then let's say that battle is won somewhat and industry reduces sugar, and then you're coming behind and saying, well, now we want lower carb, it's almost like you've shot your arrow, that too much focus on sugar distracts from the huge.
Absolutely. Well, there are a lot of reasons not to demonize sugar. One is you don't want what the behavioral psychologists call counter control. People will, well, you know what people are like. You tell people, don't put beans in your nose. They run out and get some beans and put it in their nose. People will, but the other thing is that sugar is not, it's not about particle physics. We eat sugar all the time. We know what sugar does. We know sometimes it makes us fat, sometimes it makes us sick to our stomach, sometimes it tastes great, and sometimes we get a chocolate mousse that, as they say, we're ready to die for. You make this out into a poison. Everybody knows that you're lying. Not that you're lying, but that you're exaggerating. Everybody knows that you're not doing science, and so they're not going to believe anything in medicine. They're not going to believe vaccinations. They may not even believe smoking. They'll say, these guys are all out, they're uptight, they want to keep us living on celery sticks, and, you know, it's self-defeating. And the other thing is, in its extreme, you try to tax it, you're going to wind up, suppose we find out that the total absence of sugar is bad. You know, we didn't know what to expect from low fat. Now we might have an income stream and for something that's actually harmful. Are we going to stop? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not.
Probably the best thing in balance is to highlight as a carbohydrate excessive sugar.
Well, that's what the data says. You know, we don't exclude that sugar is uniquely bad. It just has not been possible to demonstrate.
Maybe it is. Maybe it does promote more, even more than carbohydrate does. Well, who knows?
We don't know that. Yeah. It may be less. It may be, you know, that if you have to have carbohydrate, you may do better with sugar than with starch. I personally find that, actually. I don't eat much carbohydrate. But I actually respond very poorly to starch and do much better with sugar. But I don't, you know, that's not a scientific statement. I just, because I don't take enough to know.
Yeah.
But there's no data that's really conclusive. The real problem, too, is that it's done in the name of science, in the name of metabolism. And you know, most of us do 10 experiments to prove one small point about one enzyme, and then some guy is on the internet saying he's got the answer to human nutrition. It's a little hard to take.
We be a personal side to it too, yeah.
Yeah, we don't know. We don't know. What we know is that for metabolic problems like diabetes, it's the reduction in carbohydrate that is your best bet. That's what we know.
And anyway, one unifying thing is a very low carbohydrate diet, by definition, will be a low sugar one.
Right.
So maybe that's where the
also you have
is.
to remember that one of the single most important complication is that most fructose, that's the presumed unique part of sugar, is converted to glucose. So it's very hard to do a clean experiment. And my guess is that if you're on a low-carb diet, whatever fructose you do take is turned to glucose.
It'll be whipped up.
It'll be turned into glucose.
Yeah.
You won't have any effect that's different from glucose. That's my guess, but nobody knows that for sure. As you go lower, it is true that more and more fructose gets turned to glucose.
Yeah, so if it was dangerous, well, now it's even safer. So yeah. Someone did also mention another good point at the weekend. I forget, maybe it was Ted or Jeff, that there are lots of patients who have severe issues, and they've already done the sugar reduction thing. They know that, they want to help themselves. They're not losers. They really want to get better, and they've done the sugar because they know that's dangerous, but they've still got a massive problem. And as you said, that's the carb.
That's what you don't want to have.
Actually, Ted, I think, was saying that nearly all of his Indian patients are diabetic. I mean, in certain populations, the diabetes is just absolutely exploding. I think it's
very large in China, and I think has been for a while, despite
Brazil.
I don't remember what the book is called. I call it the China syndrome.
China study, that whole thing.
China study, it's nonsense.
Yeah, huge issue. Okay, so we might move on towards closing and maybe talk about, this second low carbohydrate revolution, as you've laid out so well in your book. And we're actually in the midst of it, but probably, how would one describe it? It is a revolution towards acknowledging lower carbohydrate will drive hugely improved health outcomes for diabetics and obese, and it's probably universal. It's for those guys, but it's also going to be beneficial for everyone because it will minimize hyperinsulinemia, which is the biggest problem in the world today. So maybe, towards that, do you think we're in the middle of the revolution? It's moving fast?
Yeah, well, it's very hard to describe history when you're in the middle of it, but I think this is certainly going to be a revolution, and I think it's a ratchet. It's not going to go back. So how it actually plays out, nobody knows. I think that the establishment, physicians and nutritionists are going to say, we thought of this first. And I think that's something to avoid because they won't do it right. If they could do it right, they would have done it already. And it is, it's our job. We deserve the credit for it because that's how science runs. But in any case, things will get better. I think there must be a revolution of some kind because the medical literature is now hopeless, at least in this area. The NIH is not functioning well. I mean, partly it's the lack of funding and the global problems at the NIH, but in nutrition, money is being poured into these foolish epidemiologic studies, and it's just a waste of money, and they've crossed a boundary, I think saying that red meat causes diabetes is a clear example that they've given up on any kind of common sense.
Absurdity.
So that's got to change. What the problem is that everybody has to play in the game, and so we have a lot of low carb Facebook pages, a lot of people who are interested. But what is needed is for them to put pressure on their elected officials to get a panel, find out what's going on here. I mean, the government can't solve all the problems, but what it really is good at is getting information. And it could have a problem where it could have a panel where everybody lays out their point of view, and you could get scientists who are not nutritionists, who don't have a horse in the race, physicists and computer people and meteorologists, and let them hear all sides of the story and see what can be sorted out. I mean, America, at least, is not, we're not good at by analogy, digging up Stalin's tomb. We're
Mm.
not going to go back and say these guys were bad. We're just going to move forward, but we got to move forward in a positive kind of way.
Yeah.
We can't keep doing the things that have failed all along. So I think everybody's got to play on that. It's not easy. It's certainly not easy for me to talk to my congressman, and for a person who has their own life and family, it's certainly not easy for them, but it's what is required. You got to let them know what's going on. And your congressman will talk to you, or at least their aide will. That's their job. They need to find out what the story is.
And I couldn't agree more. It needs activism, if you will, and there's a lot of it out there. It's just maybe disjointed, or it's lacking that kind of central push towards Congress to demand change. This year in February we had the world's first low carb summit in South Africa, and lchfconvention.com. You can see all these great speakers, a lot of the guys you'd have been connected with over the years. And there's a lot of websites, like you say. But something you mentioned earlier, Richard, was about maybe the whole thing around cancer. We know that carbohydrate excess causes obesity and diabetes, but it seems hard to get that true. But cancer is such a big fear, and it's the one area where they are willing to use ketogenic low carb diets. Is that
right? Well, yeah, it's very promising. The strange anomaly is that we don't really know where it fits in. We have a lot of suggestive evidence. The strong correlation between diabetes and cancer and obesity and cancer, this points us in the right direction. And at the same time, we have the basic chemistry, the downstream pathways, that is what happens in the cell after you stimulate it, point to the role of insulin-dependent pathways. And my colleague Gene Fine did really the only human study. It was very small, and it was only 10 patients, but and it was a feasibility safety study. But beyond just tolerating it, those patients who did best had the highest level of ketone bodies and the lowest level of insulin. So, again, 10 patients, you can't say too much, but it was very suggestive. What is interesting is that we got very good support. We got an excellent editorial from Lewis Cantley, who is the head of oncology at Cornell Weill. And I think it's because everybody knows this should have been done 20 years ago. I think it's just another one of those things. We got into we lost a lot of opportunities because of attaching ourselves to this low-fat craziness.
Crazy note. And the whole cholesterol obsession, of course, diverted legions of researchers for decades.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're basically, my joke is that I'm the only biochemist dumb enough to stay in this field. But that's practically true. They've chased everybody out of the field. And we're going to have a hard time putting it back together. So, on the other hand, things change very rapidly if you have the right stimulus. And it may prove that the low-fat diet heart hypothesis will turn out to be a Berlin Wall. It'll just come down overnight.
So there could be a kind of an inflection point where in the next couple of years, critical mass, it'll just all begin to collapse, and everyone will be running for cover.
Right. Well, I'll be saying that's what we've been saying all along.
that classic thing.
All of which is okay if they remember to refer to the people who did the work. Exactly.
And I would probably close with that. People like yourself, Professor Richard Feinman, thanks very much for having this conversation, and I'm delighted to have met you. And remember the book, which is only out really around several months, The World Turned Upside Down, The Second Low Carbohydrate Revolution, which hopefully is reaching an inflection point near you. Thanks, Richard.
Okay, thanks
Thank
a lot.
you.